Thank you everyone for coming today. As Jeff mentioned, this is my PhD defense, so I'll be presenting my thesis work entitled Insights from Patient-Authored Text, from Close Reading to Automated Extraction. And I'll start by answering the question that is probably on everybody's minds. What is patient-authored text, and why do we care about it? And then I'll state the contributions of our work and describe our data and methodological process. Having established these preliminaries, I'll present our first project, ADEPT, in which we address the problem of identifying medical terms in PAT. And I'll then spend the majority of my time talking about our work on Forum77, in which we focus specifically on PAT related to the topic of substance abuse. I'll go through 3 projects called Drugs of Choice, Purpose, and Phases of Addiction. And finally, I'll offer some concluding thoughts, present key areas for future work, and take questions. So when the internet became commercially available in the mid-90s, it revolutionized the way in which we interact with health data. Firstly, it made this information more available to people. It also promoted your everyday health information consumer to a health information contributor. And thirdly, it facilitated connections between people with shared interests. And so using the internet as a health resource is extremely popular and remains so, has always been extremely popular and remains so today. So in 2012, the Pew Health Online survey estimated that some 72% of American adults go online to seek health information, and that of these, 16 to 18% of them specifically seek out other people who share their health concerns. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but if we extrapolate from the Census Bureau's population estimate for the United States, this comprises some 50 to 57 million people. And the result of this is that users are online generating massive quantities of what we call patient-authored text, which is essentially any medical text that's authored by a non-medical expert. A main source of patient-authored text are online health communities, which are just online discussion boards centered around a particular medical topic. Probably everyone in this room has consumed data from an online health community, even if you've not contributed to one. And this is the type of data we use in our work. Other sources of PAT include personal blogs, email, search logs, and social media data such as Facebook and Twitter. So that's all well and good, but what actually goes into creating PAT? This here is a sample post from Forum77, MedHelp's community for addiction. This user is tapering off methadone, and he wants some advice on managing his withdrawal symptoms. And at a glance, we can tell that there's quite a bit of information here. There's a medical history. There's a treatment plan. There's a detailed record of his symptoms, including waves of depression, bad thoughts, anger, finding it hard to move. And then there's a request for advice on a specific symptom that's troubling him. These are fairly typical components of PAT. Others might include users performing drug comparisons, diagnoses, or comparing medical test results. So overall, in the process of creating PAT, users are documenting medical data, they're making sense of it, they're prioritizing it, they're synthesizing it, and they're doing this in order to solve problems that are relevant to them. And this is time-intensive work performed by highly motivated agents. And together, this work culminates in a unique record of patients' behavior outside of the clinical environment. This is especially true in the cases of embarrassing or stigmatized conditions such as hepatitis C or addiction, because prior work actually shows that such people are more likely to seek health information online and, in some cases, less likely to seek formal medical attention. So in concert, PAT comprises a valuable and, in many cases, unique medical data set. It's also abundant and readily available. But in spite of this, attempts to leverage PAT to gain medically relevant insights have been limited. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The first is that while PAT is rich with valuable data, it's extremely noisy. At the text level, we have misspellings, inconsistent grammar. At the user level, we have inconsistent participation. We have data being filtered through a human who is only including the parts that she thinks are relevant. And this person has some unknown level of medical expertise and command over medical jargon. Second, there's a dearth of existing extraction tools for analyzing PAT. So, for example, as you'll see when I discuss ADEPT, it's difficult to even extract the medically relevant terms out of PAT. This makes it hard to explore PAT corpora, let alone test hypotheses on them. And finally, the question of whether PAT actually supports a research question or not is not obvious. And it depends very deeply on the user's reason for authoring the text in the first place. So for example, it's been shown that search logs are a good data set to try to mine, to try to predict flu epidemic outbreaks from, because people are motivated to Google for their symptoms when they get sick. However, it would be unlikely that we could mine the optimal dosage of paracetamol from Twitter, because people aren't posting on Twitter the dosage of paracetamol that they use. So determining what data PAT encodes and how it's encoded is a separate challenge in and of itself. In our work, we address these challenges in a couple of ways. So to handle noisiness, we obviously focus on entity resolution and text processing, but at the human level, we leverage automated extraction to get large volumes of data. This enables us to aggregate over many people, which can compensate for individual noisiness. To address the dearth of existing tools, we follow a specific methodological framework that results in automatic classifiers, which we share to support future work. And finally, to address the question of research support, we both collaborated closely with an addiction specialist, Anna Lemke, and utilized close readings over our source text in order to develop detailed schema describing the content of the data. We call these thematic analysis, and this is actually a branch of prior work. And the goal of a thematic analysis is essentially to do a qualitative analysis over text to get a deep understanding of its content and structure. So for example, Murnane and Counts analyzed the Twitter feed of people who are attempting smoking cessation in order to determine whether their behavior changes before and after the event. It's rare, however, to see thematic analyses leveraged to the point of automatic extraction. Usually the data is hand-labeled. On the other end of the spectrum falls work on pharmacovigilance and syndromic surveillance, in which people mine PAT in order to detect adverse medical events in real time. So the example that people would be most familiar with is Google Flu, where the tool tries to predict flu outbreaks ahead of the CDC data. Another category is entity extraction, which falls under the purview of NLP and machine learning. And the goal in here is to identify particular entities in text. So for example, in collaborative work with Sonal Gupta and Chris, we use flexible pattern matching to identify drugs and treatments and symptoms and conditions in MedHelp text. And finally, some prior work does combine thematic analysis with large-scale investigations, most notably that by Mumunda Chowdhury, who analyzes postpartum depression as it manifests on users' Facebook and Twitter feeds. Now, work on ADEPT and drugs of choice falls closer to the entity extraction and syndromic surveillance side of things. And our work on phases of addiction and purpose builds on prior work and literature from thematic analyses, automated extractions, and large-scale analyses. And we make two primary contributions. First, we develop methods for automatically extracting a variety of medically relevant text from data from PAT. And second, we derive novel insights from these extracted data. What sorts of insights? Well, often they're medically relevant and they tell us something new about a condition we didn't know a lot about, but they can also be used to inform interface design or further HCI or CSCW research. And in this work, we focus specifically on the topic of addiction for reasons I'll get into after I talk about the ADEPT project. We use data from the website MedHelp, which comprises about 200 online health communities, each focused on a specific health topic. And for the general MedHelp data set, we have about 3.5 years of discussion data. And for our work on addiction, we use Forum77, which is MedHelp's forum on addiction and substance abuse. This is the largest community on MedHelp, and we have 7 years worth of discussion data comprising 80,000 threads, about 750,000 posts, authored by some 50,000 unique users. So just to get us on the same page about what these data actually look like, on the left here we have a number of names of online health communities, each community dedicated to a specific medical topic. If you look inside a community, you'll see that it's composed of a collection of threads or discussions. And if you looked into a discussion, you would see that it's comprised of an initiating post in which a user poses a question or a comment to the community, and a collection of response posts in which other people respond to the initiator. And note that the initiator can also respond to the thread later on, and we call this a self-response. And so we'll use these terms initiating post, self-response, and response posts towards the end of the talk in our work on phase. And what do we do with this data? We use a similar methodological framework throughout our work, starting with patient-authored text. A close reading gives insight into what kind of data PAT encodes and how it encodes it. This gives us a schema over the content. Now, sometimes the schema can just be internalized knowledge, and sometimes the schema is a contribution in and of itself, if it's illuminating a poorly understood area. Once we have a schema over the content, we can use it to acquire human annotated data. Depending on the complexity of the schema, this might be an iterative stage in which we use our human labels to revise the schema. But once we're satisfied with our data annotation, we then use it to train statistical classifiers to automatically label large quantities of data. Again, this can be an iterative process where we tune our classifier, where we tune our features in order to improve classifier performance. And once we're satisfied, we can then apply our classifiers to large quantity of PAT to get machine-labeled data. And then after any required post-processing, we analyze the extracted data in order to derive insights. So I'm now going to present our work on ADEPT. This work was motivated by what seemed to be a simple problem to us when we set out. Given some patient-authored text like this, how do we extract the terms that are medically relevant? For example, how do we go from this text to this, where we've highlighted the terms that are medically relevant in green? Like many before us, we turn to the most obvious solutions, which are well-known ontology-based tools, MetaMap and the Open Biomedical Annotator. Ontologies are curated collections of vocabularies with hierarchical relationships between the terms. So using these tools gives you very nice entity resolution. Unfortunately, however, they perform very poorly on PAT, and it's not just us who found this. The next obvious solution is to turn to a statistical-based tagger and train a classifier to specifically extract entities relevant to your task. Now, these models have very good performance, but can require large volumes of training data. This can be a problem, especially when you need medical experts to annotate your data, because that's both costly and time-consuming. However, given that our data is authored by non-medical experts in the first place, we hypothesized that we might be able to crowdsource this task. So we posed two hypotheses in this work. First, that a crowd of non-experts can replace medical experts at the PAT medical term identification task. And second, that classifiers trained on this data would outperform the state-of-the-art tools, MetaMap, and OBA. So to test our first hypothesis, we first needed to design a crowdsourcing task. And our original prompt, which we ran through Amazon Mechanical Turk, was to just copy-paste terms that you find medically relevant into the text box below. And we got some pretty bad results. The biggest problem was context. So users would include terms that could be medically relevant in some context, but weren't in the sentence. So in this sentence, anxiety is not a user symptom. She's talking about a social phenomenon, about talking to other people on the forum. Omission, people just wouldn't do the task. Numerical inclusion and concept granularity were very inconsistent. So some people would include drug dosages. Some people would include the term low in low blood sugar, and others wouldn't. And then repetition. Users would typically tag only one instance of a word in a sentence, even if it appeared multiple times. So we found that changing the prompt to ask users to include terms that they thought a doctor would find medically relevant actually helped the problem of context a great deal. We think this is because it made the task seem less subjective than it actually was. We tried to address the issue of omission by getting them to put NA into the text box anyway, but this is still easier than copy-pasting the terms. This didn't help much. However, when we told the Turkers that we would reject their answers if they didn't match other Turkers' answers, they stopped emitting things, and the results became quite consistent. We dealt with numerical inclusion and concept granularity through explicit examples and repetition through post-processing, simply propagating the label of medically relevant to all other identical terms in the sentence. So having designed this task, we next wanted to test the crowd's performance against medical experts. We took a sample of 1,000 sentences from MedHelp and created a gold standard by getting 3 registered nurses to label each sentence. We took majority vote for token inclusion, and then had 5 Turkers label each sentence and compared their performance across different voting thresholds to the nurses. We found that Turkers perform well against the gold standard when we use a corroborative voting policy, which requires at least 2 votes for a term to be labeled as medically relevant. And so we conclude that a crowd of medical experts is a sufficient replacement for medical experts in the PAT term identification task. Next, we train a classifier that we call ADEPT to automatically identify medically relevant terms. We choose ADEPT to be a conditional random field model, or CRF, because CRFs are especially appropriate for sequence-based and context-sensitive tasks. Basically, given an item in a sequence, a CRF can take into consideration the items that appear before and after that item in order to determine whether it belongs to a specific entity class or not. For example, in these 2 sentences, the word tired occurs in both sentences, but in the first one, it's not a symptom, whereas in the second one, it is. A context-sensitive model is able to determine that the first instance of tired is not medically relevant, while the second one is. And this is actually our classifier output, by the way. We train ADEPT on 10,000 crowd-labeled sentences and then evaluate its performance. So performance on cross-validation is good and holds to the gold standard, which was labeled by the nurses. And then we also compare it against an independent gold standard, which we source from Cure Together, which is a different online health community. And again, the ADEPT performance holds over this data set. And also notable is the fact that it dramatically outperforms the other tools, MetaMap and the OBA. So we can see how ADEPT performs on our original prompt. Green are the terms that it got correct. It incorrectly omitted night sweats, night in the term night sweats, and nightmares, and it included some terms erroneously, such as sleeping and food. But this last instance actually starts to highlight the ambiguity of this task. Food in this case could be used as a treatment for this guy's withdrawal symptoms to make him feel better. We can look at ADEPT's mistakes more generally to get insight into what it's getting wrong and right. So this chart logs term frequency against classification accuracy in our corpus, and blue dots show terms that were misclassified at least once. The size of the dot represents the number of terms. So for example, this bottom left-hand blue dot here shows that about 500 terms were never correctly classified, and these appeared only once in the test corpus. So unsurprisingly, we see that items that occur less frequently are more likely to be incorrectly classified. So we might ameliorate some of these problems by adding additional training data. And it remains to look at the terms that are commonly or ambiguously classified. And looking at these, no obvious patterns emerge, save from the exception that a lot of them were what we call generic terms. So terms like doctor, doctors, appointment. These are all terms that are definitely medical, but they contain very little information. And it turns out that human annotators struggle with whether they should include these sorts of terms as well. So we show that a crowd of non-experts can replace medical experts at this task, and this gets us cheap and scalable data annotation. But can we apply this to other sorts of entities? So we'd explored this in 2 projects. We tried to use a similar prompt to get Turkers to identify drugs and treatments in the same sort of text, and also symptoms or conditions in the same sort of texts. And we got extremely poor results. They were inconsistent and they were incorrect. And sometimes the Turkers actually defaulted to just including any medically relevant term at all. And we thought about why this was. And the task is actually quite different from the ADEPT task. It's a lot more subjective. So, for example, the term wheelchair, that's medically relevant, but is it a treatment? And there's also this sort of scoping issue. So symptom descriptions tend to span long phrases. So a sharp pain on the left side of my back spreading down to my thigh. Should you include that entire phrase as a symptom, or should you break it down into smaller components? So it turned out that this is quite a different task. And could we actually crowdsource this? Well, probably, I think so. But we would need to design the task specifically. And it became apparent that there's a trade-off between the cost of designing this task and the cost of just labeling the data ourselves. In our future projects, we don't deal with big enough data sets that we can't label it ourselves. But this remains an important area for future work, especially when you need large quantities of labeled data or when you need to rapidly replicate your data annotation. So, our crowdsourcing method gives us cheap and scalable data, but there's a trade-off between designing the task and labeling the data ourselves. And finally, our classifiers trained on the crowd-labeled data did outperform state-of-the-art tools quite dramatically. I won't go into the applications of ADEPT in the interest of time, but if you apply ADEPT to a PAT corpus, what you get is several medically relevant terms. You can do frequency and co-occurrence analyses over these terms to get a bird's eye view over the corpus's content as well as the structure within it. In the case of ADEPT, our close reading and content schema involved the iterative design of a crowdsourcing task for medical term annotation. We found that the crowd can indeed be used to annotate these data, and that we were able to train a conditional random field classifier on this crowd-labeled data to outperform existing tools. Finally, we can apply the classifier to get a quick overview of a PAT corpus. Next, I'm going to move on to our work on Forum77. But before I talk about our first project, drugs of choice, I'm going to give a brief overview of why we want to look at addiction in the first place. So, why addiction? Well, drug and alcohol use disorders present one of the most pressing public health issues of the day, and of particular concern is the escalating misuse of prescription drugs. So in 2008, more than 36,000 deaths were due to overdoses of prescription drugs. Were due to drug overdoses, and of these, those due to prescription drugs accounted for more than those caused by heroin and cocaine combined. In addition, addiction is an extremely stigmatized medical condition. So even within the medical community, the opinion that opioid misuse is a flaw in a person's moral character is quite prevalent, despite the fact that recent evidence shows that it behaves like a chronic and remitting disease. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, people are turning en masse online for help with addiction. So Forum77, second from the bottom here, is our data set. And it's the largest community on MedHelp, which says something in and of itself. We have about 750,000 posts here, but as you can see, even larger communities exist online. And these are just quick summary statistics that we gathered by hand. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm going to give a quick overview of the important points of addiction that are useful for our work going forward. So what are prescription opioids? I'm sure everyone's heard of oxycodone, Vicodin, hydrocodone. These are painkillers. They're very effective, and they're also highly addictive. A subclass of these are called opioid replacement therapy opioids. Methadone, Suboxone, and buprenorphine. They're also prescription opioids, meaning they're also painkillers, and they're also addictive. However, they're longer lasting and they're less euphoric, meaning that they're sometimes administered under the supervision of a medical expert as a replacement therapy for a more addictive drug. So what happens when you stop taking opioids? You go through withdrawal, which is quite a painful process. It's compared to severe influenza. And the duration of withdrawal depends on the drug that the user is taking, the dosage of the drug, physiological factors. But in the literature measures it to be approximately 7 to 10 days if you go cold turkey, which means you stop taking all your drugs, or 20 to 35 days in the case of a taper, which means you take smaller and smaller doses of the drug until you stop taking it. And so when does somebody recover? Well, the term recovery is very contentious. There is a lack of agreement within the medical profession as to whether you actually recover from addiction or not, and this view is held over in groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. Instead, it's thought that you're always recovering. So we use the term recovering in our work. And finally, relapse, the use of drugs after withdrawing or recovering, is common, estimated to happen in some 81 to 91% of users. So I'll now talk about drugs of choice, in which we try to identify what substances people on Forum77 are using. And why analyze this? Well, it helps us to contextualize the forum. So there are many surveys of drug-using populations out there, but they're almost all executed at point-of-care facilities, such as emergency room departments or rehabilitation facilities. Forum77 participation is voluntary. So if we find congruence in our population with these other surveys, we might be able to make epidemiological conclusions. And if we don't, we may find that we have a population here that's currently flying under the radar. There are also some useful applications out of being able to identify drugs of choice. We may be able to monitor the popularity of new designer drugs as they come out on the market. We could also test theories on addiction, such as the gateway hypothesis, which posits that drug use starts with less addictive drugs like marijuana and alcohol and moves on to more harder and illicit substances like cocaine. And there are potential interface improvements. For example, we might be able to match users who have the same drug of choice. Privacy considerations, of course. So a drug of choice is any substance that the user indicates she was or is addicted to. And this is, again, a context-sensitive problem. So in this sentence, this user's drug of choice is Suboxone because she's currently tapering off it. In this sentence, the user's drug of choice is Vicodin. I'm quitting a 10-year Vic habit. Suboxone is being used as a replacement treatment. Later on, if this user were to return to the forum and start tapering off Suboxone, then Suboxone would also become a drug of choice. And these are usually mentioned in people's initiating posts. So to automate the extraction of drugs of choice, we follow a process similar to the one that we adopted in ADEPT, except that we label the data ourselves instead of crowdsourcing the labeling. And again, a CRF classifier trained on our labeled data does well at identifying drugs of choice mentioned in initiating posts. Applying our classifier to the entire Forum77 data set then allows us to derive the drug of choice distribution over the population. We compare this to other prevalent surveys on substance use, and what we find is that Forum77 is distinct from typically surveyed populations in terms of abused substances. So these users are predominantly struggling with prescription opioid abuse. However, the more traditionally abused substances, alcohol, marijuana, and cocaine, which are the three most prevalent substances on the other forums, are quite absent in our community. We can also look at drug trends on the forum over time, and for simplicity, we only show the 6 most popular opioids here. We see these top 2 lines, hydrocodone and oxycodone, decline slightly over time, and it appears that Suboxone and methadone, our replacement treatment opioids, the pink and yellow lines here, may increase a little bit. To make it easier to see, we can combine these together. So now the orange line represents opioid replacement therapy opioids, the green line represents all other opioids, and heroin is the purple line on the bottom. So there is a slight decrease in the use of our other prescription opioids and a slight increase in the ORT opioids. Now, we'd have to do a lot more work to tie these to actual trends in the real population, but there are correlations or corroborations. For example, SAMHSA's NSATS report, which looks at methadone and buprenorphine prescriptions, has cited a steady increase in buprenorphine prescription issuing since about 2008. And recent work finds that as prescription opioids like oxycodone become harder to tamper with and acquire on the black market, people switch over to heroin because it's actually easier to acquire. To summarize, in reading this data, we discover that about half of initiating posts mention drugs of choice, and we can use hand-annotated data to train a conditional random field classifier to identify these automatically. Finally, applying our classifier to our entire data set, we find that our population is very distinct from other surveyed drug-using populations, and there's a possibility that it reflects real-world substance use trends. Next, we move on to the topic of purpose, in which we address the question of why people participate in Forum77. And why might we want to do this? This gives us insight into how Forum77 actually supports its users. So prior work does show that emotional and informational support seeking drive online health community participation. However, we want to go beyond this. What kind of support, and how is this specific to the topic of addiction? In addition to understanding users' motivations for participation, answering this question will help us drive future analyses. As we said, you really need to understand why people are authoring this text in order to leverage it to get insights. And there are some compelling potential applications, such as highlighting deficiencies in traditional treatment options, so what are people compensating for on the forum, and exposing key areas for interface improvement. To investigate users' reasons for initiating posts, we first conduct a thematic analysis over a sample of initiating posts, and I'll quickly go through the process that we used. So, based on our existing knowledge of the data set, we first derived a schema that we felt appropriately described it. We then consulted with an addiction specialist and took a sample of data from our data set, split it between two annotators, and then compared the overlapping labels in an error analysis. Based on the results, we refined our schema and repeated this process until we arrived at a schema that produced consistent labels. Congruent with prior work, we did find that informational and emotional support seeking do drive participation on Forum77. With informational support seeking, however, the majority of content regards the topic of withdrawal. It's actually quite unusual to find an informational request that does not deal with withdrawal. And in the emotional category, we had a surprise. So we did find support seeking and support giving, which is what we expected. But the most prevalent label in this category, and actually in the entire schema, is this thing called the update post. And what is an update post? An update post is exactly what it sounds like. It's a log-like report of the user's current status, and it makes no explicit request for feedback. This is a pretty typical example of an update post. I was used to taking 8 to 10 oxycodons a day. I haven't taken any of them since Friday, but I took one oxy 40 milligrams Saturday and one on Sunday morning. It's been almost 24 hours. Not too bad so far, but I'm sure there's more to come. So given the prevalence of update posts, we were able to train two classifiers. Our first, a logistic regression classifier, distinguishes informational from emotional posts, and our second distinguishes update from non-update posts. Then, of course, we analyzed the result of applying these classifiers to the entirety of our data set. We analyze a number of features, including thread lifespan, which is the number of days between the day when it was created and the last post. And one of the first things we discover is that informational threads have longer lifespans but fewer respondents. So why is this? Well, a casual analysis suggests that what happens is that these threads are easily recycled by other users. So newer users will come and read through posts on the forum, and they'll find a thread that relates to them. They'll then reply to it in order to revive it. It may be that users feel that they're capitalizing on the work that others have already done in terms of explaining a condition or set of symptoms, in terms of gathering information, or in terms of cultivating a collection of people who already care about this issue. So it may be that this is users' way of not reinventing the wheel. And while examining informational posts, we stumbled upon an informational artifact on Forum77 called Thomas's recipe, which turned out to give some interesting insight into the nature of information generation and sharing on the forum. So Thomas's recipe is a detailed schedule for medication-managed opioid withdrawal. And it actually originated on MedHelp around 2000, and it's extremely prevalent on the forum. It's very popular, and it's gone beyond MedHelp. If you Google it, you'll get AdWords sponsors for vitamin supplements to help with opioid withdrawals. So here's an example of Thomas's recipe from 2000, and I don't put this up here for you to read, but to compare structurally to the version that was posted in 2006. So there are quite a lot of changes. Number one, we have a much longer disclaimer in the new version. Number two, the ingredient list has become substantially more organized. It's even enumerated. Number three, the instructions have become much more detailed. And if you actually read through them, they've become more applicable to a general audience. So in the 2000 version, the recommended dosage of L-tyrosine is 4,000 milligrams. In the 2006 version, it's recommended that you start with 2,000 milligrams and then adjust accordingly. So why is this interesting? It's interesting because these changes do not evidence a single person tweaking a recipe. They demonstrate a collaborative influence of a larger community. And so Forum77 is more than an information repository. Some users, at least, actually use it to collaborate on treatments that are effective. And it is effective. We checked with our addiction specialist. She said this is pretty much what she would recommend to a patient, but that she hadn't thought of the L-tyrosine and that that was maybe a good idea. Our other classifier is able to distinguish update from non-update posts. An analysis of the output shows that update posts actually have much shorter lifespans, but slightly more responses than other posts. So the fact that they get similar levels of responses is interesting because there's no explicit request for feedback. This implies that this request is implicit and expected. But the shorter lifespan of the update post ties into another result, which is that the time that elapses between successive update posts is quite short. So this shows a transition graph between the update state and a non-update state. And here we see that consecutive update posts have on average 4.5 days between them, which is certainly the shortest time elapsed between any two phases. So one explanation is that when users start posting updates, they do so in quick succession. Posting the next one kills the lifespan of the old one. And taken together, it's possible that in many cases, issuing update posts is a mechanism of maintaining momentum and community support during detoxification attempts. But possibly the most interesting thing about updates is their prevalence. This indicates that users derive high utility out of issuing update posts. So what are people valuing here? So anecdotally, we think that one thing that users value is simply being witnessed, right? This could be a self-enforcement mechanism to stay on a withdrawal schedule or to prevent relapse. But we do see users exhibiting a great deal of shame when they relapse, and they don't want to come back to the community before they've started another detox attempt. But there's also a clear value in documentation, and we see users reflecting on their update posts in the past. So both for inspiration to progress if they've relapsed, or as a way of generating a sense of self-efficacy if they've successfully withdrawn. They also use this as data. So we've seen users go back and say, well, I checked my post and last time it took me 19 days. So maybe if I try this time it'll take me 15 days to detox. Other users also value people's update posts. They read through them as a way of getting a sense of what lies ahead. So to summarize, our close reading in this case comprised a thematic analysis in which we elucidated categories describing users' reasons for participating in Forum77. Congruent with prior work, we found that emotional and informational support seeking drive participation, but we also found that most informational posts pertain explicitly to the topic of withdrawal, and that the most prevalent emotional post is the update. Because the update post is so prevalent, we're able to train two classifiers. They distinguish emotional from informational posts and update from non-update posts. And through applying them, we get some insight into what users value about participating in the forum. They also use it for collaborative treatment development, they value having an audience, and they value it as a mechanism for public documentation. Finally, in our last project on Forum77, we investigate the phase of addiction. What do I mean by this? So, everyone has heard of this thing called the cycle of abuse. But what does it actually mean? It turns out that there is not a well-established definition or agreed upon cycle of abuse, right? And moreover, to the best of our knowledge, there have been no attempts to quantify it. We have no idea, for example, how many times people relapse on average before achieving some sort of sustained recovery. And for example, we don't know how long people tend to use for after they relapse before they try to quit again. So in this project, we seek to define and quantify the cycle of abuse as it manifests on Forum77. And this gives us crucial insight into the role that Forum77 plays in the process of addiction recovery. It's also, as far as we know, the first attempt to quantify a cycle of abuse in any sort of data set. Again, we conduct a thematic analysis similar to our purpose project over initiating posts in order to derive a schema describing users' phases. For those familiar with the trans-theoretic model of behavior change, I have the labels here on the left, but I'm going to focus on the column Forum77 labels, which are the labels that emerged in our thematic analysis. We can see that a variety of phases manifest on Forum77. from use of substances to intention to quit to planning to quit. There's a lot of cessation attempts. Being able to tell whether users are tapering or going cold turkey is a little more rare. And then there are also a lot of users here who are currently recovering. Now, although this level of detail is interesting, these categories are too fine-grained for the computational models that we currently have. So accordingly, we collapse them into three main classes. Using, when someone is using drugs prior to a cessation attempt. Withdrawing, when someone is currently trying to quit. And recovering, when someone has overcome the acute withdrawal symptoms and is no longer detoxing from a substance. Now, there were two things about this rubric that caused us to reconsider our unit of analysis from the post to a sequence. So the first is the low prevalence of relapse labels here. It turns out that while relapse is very, very common, users don't come to the forum and say, guys, I relapsed and I'm using again. Actually, they're more likely to come back after they've started another cessation attempt, perhaps in an attempt to generate social capital again on the forum that they feel that they've lost. The other thing is the high prevalence of NA posts. These are posts for which we just can't tell what phase the user is in. That's not very useful. So looking at sequences actually can eliminate both of these cases. So imagine that each circle here is a day in a user's tenure, and it's red if they're using on that day, yellow if they're withdrawing, green if they're recovering, and blank if they don't post on the forum. Imagine that we pulled this post out for our sample. It's pretty hard to tell what phase this guy's in. He's just being social. However, if we look at the posts surrounding this post, it's quite clear that he's in the middle of a cessation attempt. And so we can basically propagate that label through here. We can also see relapses easily on sequences. So here's a relapse. This user left in a state of recovering and has returned and they're withdrawing. That means that they used again, but they didn't come back to the forum when they did it. So to acquire a sample of labeled sequence data, we restrict our sample to users who've initiated at least 5 posts so that we can get a sequence. And then we randomly sample 200 users from this group and all of their initiating posts. 2 annotators then labeled this by hand and resolved disagreements through discussion and consultation with the rubric. With our labeled data set then, we can start to look at how features differ across these different categories. So the phases of addiction in real life correlate with this distinct psychological and physiological states. So are these mirrored in people's online contributions and behavior? And to do this, we look at a number of features across our hand-labeled data set. We look at behavioral features, which describe what kinds of contributions people made. Were they initiating posts, responses, self-responses? We looked at how long it was since they last initiated any of these kinds of activity. And we look at this over 3 time windows, globally, locally over the last 5 days, and currently within the last 24 hours. We also look at content features. The linguistic inquiry and word count indexes a number of linguistically relevant features over text. We also use a feature that we call the number of days clean mentioned. So this is when someone says, hey guys, I've been clean for 10 days, or I've been off Roxy's for 10 months. And we also include a more relaxed version of this feature, which is the number of days mentioned without the word clean or off or so forth. This is because users who are often withdrawing say, hooray, day 4, day 5, but they don't specifically say the words clean or off. And our goals here are twofold. 1, to characterize people's behavior through these different phases, but 2, to identify features that will be useful for classifier training later on. So using is characterized by long absences from the forum. These people are not very active, and this may account for the slightly longer post length. Maybe they need to catch other users up with what they've been doing since they were gone. They had an unusually high value for our feature measuring how many days clean they mentioned, right? And this didn't really make sense. So we went back to the data to examine why this happened. It turns out in these cases, users are often lamenting clean time that they lost. So they'll say something like, if I hadn't relapsed, I would have had 9 months today, or something like that. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they also demonstrate the lowest levels of positive affect. This is mirrored in response posts to using responses. Withdrawing users, on the other hand, are highly active users on the forum, and especially in the region of initiating posts and responding to those posts that they initiate. They have the fewest days mentioned, which makes sense because they're saying things like, it's day 5, it's day 6. And they have more language about feeling and biological processes. Now, this reflects the fact that withdrawal is physically an uncomfortable experience. Now, recovering users are also extremely active, but whereas withdrawing users were about initiating posts, recovering users are about responding to other people's posts. They also have the highest levels of positive affect, the lowest levels of anxiety, and we observe a very prevalent number of exclamation marks in responses to posts issued by people who are recovering. And they're just getting positive feedback and congratulations from other forum members. So using these features amongst others and a fully hand-labeled user sequence data, we train a CRF classifier that is able to annotate phase sequences reasonably accurately. So compared to a baseline F1 score of 20%, 68% performance is not bad. It's good enough to examine some aggregate trends. It's probably not good enough to examine an individual's fine-grained sequence over time. So applying our classifier to our entire sample of users, we can then start to look at transition probabilities. So this transition matrix shows conditional probabilities from a source state represented by a row to a target state represented by a column. So for example, people who are using are 70% likely to be using when they next post, 25% likely to be withdrawing, and 5% likely to be recovering. And what we see here is the strong diagonal shows that people post consecutively in the same state. That's what we expected. And we also see that the progressive edges, which is the top right half of this matrix, are more prevalent than regressive edges, which is the bottom left half. We can also use our CRF annotated sequences to examine phase length distributions. So here we see that users actually don't stay in using for too long on the forum, probably because they get a lot of encouragement to either start a cessation attempt or they leave. The window for withdrawing is slightly smaller, and note how well this aligns with what the addiction literature states is the expected window of withdrawal, 7 to 35 days. People who withdraw faster than that likely relapse. And then recovery is the longest lasting state. And note here on the right, there's a long tail suggesting that a great number of users on the forum have achieved some kind of sustained abstinence. Recovery and relapse are important events in addiction, and we can use our CRF-labeled sequences to identify them. To identify whether a user relapses during her tenure on Forum77, we search for regressive sequence patterns. So for example, any sequence where a user goes from recovering to using or withdrawing, from withdrawing to using, and any sequence in which a user goes from withdrawing is absent for 45 or more days and withdraws again. And the reason why we use this last sequence is because it's unlikely that someone would be withdrawing for so long without participating on the forum. Extracting these patterns, we're able to identify whether a user relapsed in their tenure at least once quite well. And then we also investigate what a user's state was when she last posted on the forum. So the very last post of her tenure, was the user recovering or not? And here we're just looking for sequences that either end in recovering versus ending either in using or withdrawing. And applying this search over our sequences, we're able to identify this quite accurately too. So extracting these patterns over our annotated sample, we can then examine this in aggregate. So this chart visualizes user progressions through addiction during their tenure on Forum77. On the left, we have the breakdown in distribution in what state people come into the forum, whether or not they relapse, and the state they're in their last post. So most users start off using, a good number start off withdrawing, and we see here that almost half of them relapse during their tenure. But despite this, looks like recovery is a favorable prognosis for almost anyone. So One question we might ask is whether relapsing hurts your chances of ending your tenure in recovery. So yes, relapsed users are less likely to end in a state of recovery. They have about a 44% chance of doing so rather than a 53% chance. However, recovering is still the most likely outcome, regardless of whether you relapse or not. Now, is this good? It's hard to tell because very little work in addiction actually investigates self-detoxification. If we interpret this as a 46% success rate over a user's final detox attempt, then this is an improvement of literature-reported success rates. However, we're comparing across very different study designs, so we should take that as suggestive only. Finally, we might want to know what gets a person to recovering. Is there something different about the users who end their tenure in a state of recovering? It turns out that users who are recovering during the time of their last post behave significantly differently on the forum during the times that they're using and withdrawing. Most notably, they're much more engaged in the forum. They're much more frequently participating, and they respond much more to other users. It's hard to tell whether this is causal, but this does resonate with literature in Alcoholics Anonymous, which shows that increased participation and engagement with the group corresponds with a higher likelihood of achieving sustained sobriety. So to summarize, through a thematic analysis over initiating posts, we uncover three main categories describing the phases of addiction: using, withdrawing, and recovering. Analyzing behavioral and content features of posts in each of these phases show that user behavior is quite distinct across the states, and we're able to train a CRF classifier using these features and our labeled data to annotate phase sequences from which we can extract important events, relapse and recovery. And finally, analyzing these sequences, we find that while relapse is common, recovery is likely and correlates with high participation. To conclude, I'll first reiterate the contributions of this work, and then I'll finally go over some important areas for future work that build on what I've presented here today. Our first contribution is methods for automatically extracting medically relevant data from PAT. We explored crowdsourcing medical term annotation as an alternative to getting medical experts to annotate these terms. We found that this was feasible, but not for all types of tasks, and that there's a trade-off in task design versus labeling the data yourself. We leveraged thematic analyses to build content schemas over more abstract or hidden data contained in PAT, and we show how these are both contributions in and of themselves, for example, describing the cycle of addiction, and they're also useful as annotation rubrics for hand labeling data. Building on the addiction literature, we employ a detailed feature analysis to determine how users' behavior changes as they move through the phases of addiction in the real world correlate with their behavior online. And ultimately, we were able to train classifiers that automatically extract a variety of medically relevant data from PAT, including medical terms, drugs of choice, the purpose of participation, and the phase of addiction. Our second contribution is insights derived from these extracted data. As I mentioned, these can be medically relevant. For example, we found that Forum77 is distinct from other surveyed drug-using populations. This means that studying it may actually reveal something interesting that we currently aren't able to observe through existing surveys. Another interesting finding is that users actively collaborate on treatments. This might be an interesting application, crowdsourcing treatment development. Other insights stand as contributions relevant to the CSCW and HCI communities. For example, we found that users value being witnessed and documenting their journey through the process of addiction. And we also have compelling evidence suggesting that participating in Forum77 plays an important role in aiding the withdrawal process. Certain users are most likely to be recovering. Certainly, users are most likely to be recovering by the time that they leave, although we do need to remember that our data are censored. We don't know what happens to them after they leave the forum. However, it may be helpful just to have a tool and to enhance a tool that will help you withdraw successfully. So in concert, our contributions both underscore PAT's latent value for illuminating poorly understood or clandestine medical topics, and offer viable methods that dramatically improve our ability to realize this value. There's several areas of future work that could build on what I've presented here today. One is supporting the methodological process that we exposed. So, for example, it would be really helpful to have interface support for thematic analysis. Currently, this does not exist, but thematic analysis is used a lot to derive these deep understandings of qualitative data. It's very hard to track your provenance, to share with other people, and creating tools for these sorts of things would actually help to standardize the process, make it more accessible to everyone else. The next area is to push from medical insights to medical discoveries. So, for example, could we identify new designer drugs from these data? Such work would require intense collaboration with medical researchers in order to acquire epidemiological validity. But another thing to look into is, does Forum77 participation aid long-term recovery? We would actually need to interact with users in real time and see how Forum77 complements their other treatment modes in order to determine this. And finally, our insights suggest a number of ways in which we might be able to improve, design, and support existing patient-authored text contribution interfaces. So, for example, we could align users with sponsors in Forum77 to get them to participate more. We could expose data-driven withdrawal information. So not only are people looking for this on the forum, they read very slowly through other people's posts in order to aggregate this in their minds. Not only are they looking for it, but it's also been shown that telling someone the severity of the symptoms that they're going to experience with withdrawal actually results in them being more likely to complete their withdrawal process. And finally, given that users are invested in documenting their experience, we could use something like our update classifier to automatically construct timelines and enable users to compare their timelines with other people's. So to summarize, there are a lot of improvements we could do on this methodological process, from interface support on thematic analysis to feature exploration and to extraction. From our insights, we could move on to deriving medical discoveries with the collaboration of medical researchers. And we could feedback a lot of the things we've already developed and use our insights to improve PAT interfaces. And before I take questions, I just want to thank everyone again for being here, especially to those of you who traveled. And one of the best things about being at a place like Stanford is the people you get to meet and learn from. And I'd like to acknowledge some folks who've been especially influential during my time here. So first, of course, my advisor, Jeff. Jeff has been an incredible source of inspiration, support, and knowledge to me during my 5 and a bit years here. Jeff's advice and input are always spot on and generously given. But even more importantly, he's been an exemplary role model to me. So I'm both grateful and proud to have him as an advisor. Of course, to my committee, Stu Card, Michael Bernstein, Chris Manning, Justin Grimmer, thank you all for being here. Chris, for all your input on the work we've collaborated with. And Stu, without your exceptional tactical abilities, I don't think I'd have as good deadline meeting skills as I do today. To my collaborators, Sonal, it's been a pleasure to work with you, and I look forward to continuing to do so. And to Anna Lemke, who couldn't make it here today, but whose enthusiasm about this work and generosity with her time really was invaluable in marrying our work with addiction literature and understanding that. The inimitable Margot Seltzer, who got me into this whole business in the first place. And to the amazing people I've met in my time here, there are so many of you, my good friends, Sudhindra, Catherine, Jonathan, you're all wonderful. Last but not least, my husband, Isa, who's been making me push the envelope a little bit every day since I met him, and my mom, who traveled here especially so that she could finally find out what I've been up to for the last 5 years. And I'll take questions.
So you found that people who were more active on the forum during the withdrawal phase were more likely to succeed in quitting. Do you know whether that was due to more like they got more community support, or whether it was just the act of posting itself that was leading to
I mean, I could hypothesize it's also possibly a selection bias, right? Maybe people who are more active are just more motivated to quit or have some sort of, you know, internal drive that makes them more successful at quitting. It may be the collaborative support that they get. The community is very supportive, so I would hesitate to say that people don't get a lot of support unless they're kind of mean. So I don't know, it could be that. I think it could be a selection bias. So this is a huge problem in analyzing Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, and it's well cited in that literature too. Yeah.
How do you deal with people using acronyms and inconsistent spelling and stuff like that?
Glad someone asked.
We did a massive amount of entity resolution, which I didn't go over because it was quite long, but we did most of it manually, actually. So we found 58 different ways of spelling Vicodin. And then we actually collaborated a lot with Anna Lemke, who's a psychiatrist, to resolve a lot of those drugs to categories. So, you know, like opioids and sedatives and stuff like that. So it was mostly a manual process. And yes, I think you could automate it. That would be a different project. Yeah.
So you said that a lot of the update posts got responses. I'm wondering what the nature of those responses were. Are there a lot of like congratulations, or did people actually like go through the phase together, for example? Let's get together and do the 12 steps together?
That's a really great question. Like, I would love to know if people sort of go through the phases together. My guess would be that. My guess is that a lot of people who are responding, and it's supported in the data, are those who've already recovered. So if you look at 12-step programs like AA and NA, the 12th step is to help other people recover, you know, to maintain your own sobriety. So my guess is that a lot of the people who do that have already recovered. I don't know if they go through the phases together. I lost the second half of your question, though.
I think you answered the second half.
Oh, good.
The first half was what was the nature of the response?
Oh, positive reinforcement and encouragement mostly. Yeah, there was some shared experiences. So it's something that we haven't analyzed response posts, and that's something we really would like to do. I would like to do in future work. It's interesting. But people like to jump off people's stories and tell their own narration. So they'll take a point from someone's story and tell something similar that happened to them. There's a lot of narrative going on there too. Yeah.
So you started getting at this in future work, but so now if you got control of Forum77 for like a month and you got to add whatever features you'd like, what would you like to add now to help people recover?
I think I'd first give them the data on withdrawal. I think that, I mean, so you'd have to be careful how you do this because they don't want to feel like you're kind of spying on them, right? But I think that I think it would be interesting to interview some of those community leaders and ask how to introduce data-driven insights back into the forum. Because they really are, so there are parts of the forum that you don't want to replace. Like there's value in getting feedback, even if it's a question that's been asked before, people feel connected. But there are other parts that are inefficient and users find that they're inefficient, and then they'll start polling people. They'll be like, how many people have successfully tapered off this versus that? And they'll, you know, try to get responses. And that sort of thing, I think you could make more accessible. And I think patients are really smart enough to deal with that sort of data and should have access to it. Yeah, that's what I do. You were next.
Hey, fantastic talk. I thought you motivated it really well with what, I didn't realize what a huge public health problem this is. So that's really cool. Now, I want to ask a very broad, high-level question, which is, we saw a lot about drug addiction and how people try to overcome it in this talk. What about the topic of what causes this and where this comes from, and can we prevent this from happening in the first place? Now, I realize that's not been the focus of your research, but could we get at that in the same data? Is there information there? Do we know something about that?
I think this is quite well addressed in the addiction literature already. So, well, perhaps not. You do have a point. So a lot of people that we read about, they are prescribed pain medication for legitimate reasons, and they get addicted to it. And one type of user that I see often, which I just feel that they're in a catch-22. They do have some chronic pain condition, and they have a choice to be addicted to the meds or to be in pain. And that, I think, I don't really know how you deal with that. But I'm not sure this would be the best data set for figuring out how people get addicted in the first place. For figuring out where people get their drugs from, that's something that Sonal and I talked about a little bit, and that you might be able to do, because people talk about getting them, from their friends, from their doctors. There was even a case where someone was buying them from his parents because they were broke and he felt bad, and so they sold him their, yeah. So you could get a pretty deep answer to where people get the drugs from, which is also interesting in ameliorating the problem and plugging, black market holes. Yeah. You had anything?
Could you possibly bring up the graph with kind of the start state versus end state and the relapse section? Because I noticed
This
in
one?
there's a very significant portions of users that where their start state is their end state as well, and so was wondering kind of those users. What was the threshold for how long a user had to be active on the forum to be included in your data sets? Or maybe like any users who were just on there for a very short period of time?
Right. So that's a good point. So we didn't have a time threshold. It was a post threshold. So if they'd initiated 5 or more posts on the forum, and I would agree with you that it is likely that a lot of those users who start and end in the same state, they're probably just shorter lived and they actually haven't left the forum. But it's hard to tell if someone's left because they might come back, So that's a good question. Yeah, something that would be good to explore.
So given that you're able to observe their withdrawal plans as well as their success rates, that effectively suggests some kind of you can come up with a formula for this is the optimum taper off rate that will maximize your success rate, right? Have you tried have you ever compared that with what a professional would say?
Well, so we did look at Thomas's recipe and we did look over it with Anna and go through it. So this is one of those cases where I'm not sure the data is fine-grained enough to get an absolute answer to your question. So for every person we see successfully quitting, we don't necessarily know what their tapering rate was, but sometimes we do. We might be able to extract it, but I think that it would be difficult without demographic data because so much of the duration depends on physiological factors like your weight or your gender. Yeah.
So something to ask about what you might do to actually improve the quality of the data that's coming in. And I'm wondering if you've thought about insights that might become available if the data was a little bit better. If the text was better, or if you had maybe user-provided labels on the data or something like that.
I mean, something I've wanted to do is a symptom autocomplete. So if someone talks about having restless legs, they're probably also going to have, because one thing we have is incomplete lists of symptoms. So people will only list what they find severe, but sometimes the fact that something is missing is interesting. So imagine you typed in that, I have restless legs, and you get a checkbox or something of other symptoms that you may or may not have. And that would give us much more detailed and fine-grained data. So I think that's one way in which you can improve it. I also just think by making it more efficient for users to get the information that they want, you're going to filter out a lot of the cruft that you have to begin with, and then I think your text will become more relevant with what you're working with. So I think you could get this sort of virtuous cycle in which you improve the interface, you get better data, and so forth. Yeah.
I'm curious, that was excellent. I'm curious over the user's life cycle, what was the distribution of times that they relapsed? And then also, did some people start in a relapse state and specifically mention that? I'm wondering if people, for example, due to social pressure, came to the forum and was like, oh yeah, it's the 3rd time I've relapsed, but they were forced by social pressure to make a new account.
So the answer to your first question is I don't totally know. So as we saw for our sequence-based CRF, we can use that to find out whether someone relapsed at least once, but it doesn't necessarily give us an exact count of how many times people relapsed, right? Anecdotally, it happens often, and it's sometimes ambiguous. I mean, there are a lot of half-hearted withdrawal attempts where people will be like, oh, it's day 4, but I took a pill this morning, no biggie, you know? So not sure what's going on there. The second part of your question, can you just refresh my memory?
I was just wondering about people that start in sort of a relapse stage.
Yes. Do they make new accounts?
Yes.
No. They try. And then people who use the forum a lot catch them out. They actually share a lot of personal information with each other. So you'll know things like whether the person has a husband or kids or a dog, or they might mention what state they live in. And so the other community members actually hunt them down and say, you are Tom99, aren't you? You're deceiving everyone, and it's very negatively perceived. Yeah. Yeah.
Since you have a way of contacting the users of the forum, and you have also kind of like tracked where are the patterns that land them through withdrawal, would it be interesting to maybe like contact them at that phase when you recognize that some user is actually at that point and try to bring them back to the forum?
So I've wondered about interventions. Yes, maybe. I think it's hard to say. I think that you're walking a very fine line between privacy and feeling that you're being observed and actually helping someone. There's evidence showing in addiction that intervening at a particular stage of behavior change doesn't necessarily help, but there are a lot of different study designs. It's really impossible to get a conclusive answer there. I don't know. So I think intervention is an interesting question. I think it needs to be very delicately handled. Yeah. I think that's probably all we have time for.
Let's thank our speaker.